Video games are often overshadowed by their entertainment counterparts, but despite the social disparity, the video game industry usually outpaces the film industry on a yearly basis. Films occasionally draw inspiration from video games, as evident in the newly released Spider-Man Far From Home, but never in a truly meaningful way. It's nice seeing nods and references from time to time, but video games usually aren't cited as the source of drastic cinematic revelation the same way films are. You never hear filmmakers saying, "I thought I knew everything about film, but then I played Metal Gear Solid, and it really changed my perspective on cinema." Well, Jordan Vogt Roberts, the director of Kong Skull Island and the planned Metal Gear adaptation, might say that, but that's the exception, not the norm. You hear of Citizen Kane or 2001: A Space Odyssey, but not The Last of Us or Persona. Is that because there isn't anything video games can teach film or TV? Are the narrative techniques certain films use impossible to translate to video games? Or is it just that no one has found a way to do it? Perhaps it's due to video games' inherent reliance on gameplay over narrative. You have to make a good game before you tell a great story. You can't make something confusing for the player because there needs to be a consistent loop or mechanic, so you employ a traditional linear structure. Where do game creators find the space to iterate and innovate? It's possible. I think of moments like the flashback in Uncharted 3, or how A Way Out frequently changes its presentation and gameplay to suit the situation. Not only are there lessons that film can learn from video games, there are actually elements that no form of media can replicate from video games. While the public validation from strangers or the billions of views music videos get would be nice, video games don't need it, because they're already exemplifying certain narrative techniques that video games inherently excel at due to their interactive nature. And one of those narrative techniques isn't native to video games. It's the dual narrative. A dual narrative can mean many things and have many different interpretations, but it can mostly be simplified to the idea that it's one story presented from two altering perspectives. It's a very common narrative style, and many filmmakers see the dual narrative as a surefire way to create an engrossing narrative. Some examples of a dual narrative can include Gone Girl, which is a linear narrative that follows one story from two different perspectives. The Departed, a narrative that follows two stories that intertwine. The Godfather Part 2, a narrative that follows two stories from two different time periods that are relevant to one another. Or Yakuza 0, a narrative that follows two seemingly unconnected stories that end up being extremely relevant to one another. And stick a pin in Yakuza 0 because I'll get back to that in a bit. A dual narrative can be as simple as cutting to the antagonist's perspective every once in a while, or as complex as telling two complete stories within the same experience. Creating a dual narrative also comes with some risks, however. Creators can't simply toss in an extra perspective and call it a day. One side has to be just as engaging as the other. If the audience doesn't connect with one of the perspectives, that's potentially 50% or more of the story they're tuned out of. So, considering the risks, why use a dual narrative structure? What can be gained that you couldn't using only one character or more than two? It really comes down to contextualizing the narrative and its characters. Instead of attempting to fully realize one character, it attempts to fully realize two. This can potentially create a more enriching narrative, as the audience on their own, with all the context, can find certain parallels, connections, or other elements that bind the story together. It can also create some shocking moments when the two fully fleshed out worlds collide, as was the case in the aforementioned The Departed. Personally, I'm not always a fan of the dual narrative. I think a true, well-crafted dual narrative is actually pretty rare. I typically prefer stories that progress linearly and follow one specific character, but maybe I have video games to blame for that. Video games have a traditionally straightforward progression. You hit start, or any button these days, you go through the level, you beat the boss, you keep going, do that some more, and then you see the credits. Some games feature multiple playable characters like the upcoming Final Fantasy VII Remake, or cut to the antagonist's perspective now and then. But they ultimately move forward in one single line until the player reaches the end. This is how it's been since video games had progression in the first place, and it's mostly how video games are now. What a lot of video games do is tell a parallel or otherwise separate but still relevant story through audio logs or notes, most notably in games like The Last of Us or Resident Evil. However, this isn't a dual narrative. It's an extra plotline on top of the game, but the player is still experiencing this story through the eyes of the protagonist. Games can have amazing environmental storytelling, another great storytelling technique that video games are inherently perfect for, but it's not a dual narrative. This is how most games present their multi-perspective stories. You're still each game's respective protagonist, and you learn about other stories from their perspective. perspective. Think Dark Souls, Metal Gear Solid 5, The Division, and other mostly open-world games. Things are changing, however. The standard linear progression games traditionally use is changing with the advent of more cinematic, story-focused experiences. Detroit Become Human is a great example. It's not a dual narrative, it's a triple narrative, and the way the storylines intersect and influence each other is pretty remarkable. But what does Detroit do that a movie couldn't? It could be argued that Detroit works because a lot of the narrative is based on the decisions the player makes, but with recent developments like Black Mirror Bandersnatch, the idea of a cinematic choose-your-own-adventure experience isn't something that's entirely unique to video games anymore. Albeit, I still think games like Detroit and The Walking Dead do it better than Bandersnatch, but it's still something that's not impossible for filmmakers to try too. A focused dual narrative is hard to come by in video games. There's either one main character or a selection to choose from. To choose a dual narrative in a game is a bold artistic choice that requires a ton of thought and effort. But with games relatively recently breaking free of the traditional linear approach, there have to be some major examples to draw from. There are only a few games that utilize a dual or otherwise non-linear structure, but I want to focus on two specifically: Yakuza 0 and Resident Evil 2. The reason I bring up these two games, or three technically, is to demonstrate the perfect execution of a dual narrative compared to one with a lot of problems. And just so we're clear, Yakuza 0 is the perfect one, and Resident Evil 2 is the one with a lot of problems. I'm also referring to these two on both a gameplay level as well, not just story. This will also include spoilers from both games, so consider this your spoiler warning. Yakuza 0 begins with series protagonist Kiryu as he collects a debt with some interest in a place in Kamurocho called the Empty Lot. This lands Kiryu in deep trouble after he's framed for the murder of the person he collected from. As the player, we know Kiryu didn't kill him, despite Kiryu being perfectly capable of killing someone with his bare hands, but we know because we followed him from the collection onward. We as the audience, like Kiryu, don't know the importance of the Empty Lot until Kiryu's superiors in the Tojo clan, specifically Kuze-san, pointed out to him. And even then, there's still a huge mystery afoot. Who framed Kiryu? Why? What's the true significance of the Empty Lot? And, most important of all, who does it belong to? When we meet Majima, we're in a completely different city with a completely different tone. We're not in the back alleys of Tokyo's red light district making money explode out of people using our fists. We're in the highbrow cabaret clubs of Osaka, Sotenbori to be exact, in an excess of wealth and entitlement. We're not bashing heads in, we're almost literally killing with kindness. This dichotomy is the perfect example of why a dual narrative can be fantastic for games. Variety. Not only do you get gameplay variety, which I'll touch on later, but you'll also get these two completely different perspectives for considerably longer than a film's length. Yakuza is a franchise infamous for constantly shifting tones, going from absolutely hysterical one moment only to be absolutely heartbreaking another. And to exemplify that even further with the two protagonists is absolutely genius. Another example of how Yakuza 0 masterfully handles the concept of a dual narrative is how, in one perspective, things will escalate until you need to know what happens next, and then it'll cut to the next chapter in Majima or Kiryu's storyline. So you stick it out. You think, I'd rather keep going with Kiryu or Majima depending on where you're at in the story, but I'll get through this so I can get back to them sooner. And then, before you even realize it, you're just as invested in the new story that's been presented to you as you were with the story you thought you desperately needed to return to. Even though you may not have wanted to leave Kiryu or things were just getting good with Majima, the game still finds ways of making you care just as much about one side of the coin as the other. And that cycle continues throughout the entire game, keeping the audience engaged with both characters until the very end, with one of the best endings of all time because the story has been enriched so heavily by the two protagonists in the story that connected them. The ending has weight not only because it's the ending to the overarching story and finally unites the two protagonists, it's because it also contextualizes the two characters for the journey they're about to take part in. Yakuza 0 is the perfect example of a dual narrative and a perfect prequel too. Yo. Kiryu-chan! On the other end of the spectrum lies Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 features two main protagonists, Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield, who are quickly united and separated at the beginning of the journey, but meet up from time to time. Resident Evil 2 is a weird one. It's a very uniquely video game version of a dual narrative. There are two campaigns, so depending on what you choose, you won't see the other character's perspective until you play through their campaign. When Claire pops into Leon's campaign, you really don't know why she is where she is unless you play through her story. This is where things get wacky though. Like in the original game, there's a Part A and a Part B structure. If you choose one character, you play all the way to his or her ending, then you play a second run version with the other character. This essentially shows the story again, but from their their perspective, but this is the only way you get any sense of congruence or consistency. Let's say you start over with a fresh story and you want the full story from the opposite perspective, not just the second run version. Aside from certain areas and moments toward the beginning and ending of the game, Leon's and Claire's campaigns are nearly identical. Instead of both plausibly taking place at the same time, it seems as though one story replaces the other. It's almost as if you've played the other campaign, it makes the other side even more confusing, which is the antithesis of a good dual narrative. The original game ties the two sides together a little more cohesively, but it still suffers from some of the same issues. Like the remake, instead of two whole campaigns, it's split in half, and who you choose for what half is up to you, but it's generally accepted that, canonically, it's Claire A, Leon B. Unlike the remake, however, Part B is a bit more extensive than Second Run. The player can also leave certain items behind for the other character, which isn't something you can do in the remake. It works a little more congruously, but the idea of canon routes still muddies the water. However, I give Capcom huge credit for attempting this kind of narrative structure in the late 90s, a time when video game storytelling was still modernizing. Resident Evil 2 also fails to capture how a video game can exemplify a dual narrative to its core and how the game controls. Aside from character models and animations, Claire and Leon are essentially the exact same. Movement, aiming, and general gameplay is exactly the same, regardless of who you choose to play as. There's a pretty significant difference between Leon's shotgun and Claire's grenade launcher, but that's about as far as that goes. In Yakuza 0, while Kiryu and Majima both traverse identically, they have significant differences in the way they fight. This is the potential that video games can unlock when utilizing dual narratives. The potential to establish a variety of different tones and settings to enrich the narrative, but also to establish different gameplay styles that can enrich the narrative and the gameplay experience. Sometimes I struggle when it comes to explaining video games. When I talk about games, I often talk about how they feel. If you aren't familiar with video games, the idea of knowing what a game feels like is somewhat bizarre. It's something you don't need to explain to someone who plays games, because with experience, you can already imagine what it feels like to play games that aren't even out yet, like Cyberpunk 2077 or The Outer Worlds. Game feel connects us to our characters. The player almost literally walks in their shoes and experiences the world vicariously through them. The controls need to facilitate that connection, obviously, but a game doesn't need to be immersive in order for the player to connect to its world, which is something I talked about in my last video essay. This is what video games have that any other medium lacks: feel. To truly feel the difference between two characters, between two perspectives. Music and film can evoke what it feels like to be in two different people's shoes, but video games take that a step further to allow the audience to physically manifest themselves and to literally see things from that character's perspective. That's the creative potential of video game storytelling. It's why Hideo Kojima, despite totally being able to call up his film buddies to make a real live-action film, still opts to express his creative vision through video games. It's the ability to feel. And it's why concepts that were invented in literature and film, like the dual narrative, can't be realized to their full potential until a talented enough creator can expertly explore that concept in a video game. Now, the idea of game feel isn't anything new to anyone who's been playing video games for a relatively long time, but what does this mean for dual narratives in games? I believe gameplay allows for even more opportunities to connect with and empathize with a secondary character's viewpoint. Imagine if, in The Last of Us, instead of the winter being the only time in the game when the player controls Ellie, it was an even 50-50 split between Joel and Ellie. How would this have created an even deeper connection with the characters? And how would their personal struggles relate to the situations at hand? Or what if it goes beyond a companion? What if, in Final Fantasy VII, you played as Sephiroth just as much as you played as Cloud? The opportunities to contextualize antagonists within a gaming dual narrative are extremely promising, but they have to be done right. I'm reminded of vehicle sections in games that aren't fun to play, or when a section of a game has the player controlling a different character, but it's annoying or too different to the core gameplay design. The second character has to feel consistent with the game's mechanics, but they also need to feel different enough to create a diverse and unique experience. Games that already do this well include Yakuza, Devil May Cry 5, or Batman Arkham City. Games that don't do this but could've include The Last of Us, Resident Evil 2, or Halo 2 and 5. I think a simple but effective way of showcasing the dichotomy between Master Chief and Spartan Locke would have been to have made Chief go it alone, but still have Locke retain his team. Just there, we can see that Chief is a lone operator, while Locke relies on his allies. It would have added variety to the gameplay experience, and it also would have further contextualized the two characters. It goes beyond dual narratives though. I think dual narratives could be just the beginning of further narrative experimentation in gaming. The idea of game feel has the potential to enrich any storytelling structure, even a non-linear narrative like Pulp Fiction or The Godfather Part 2. And I know visual novels and other narrative-focused games like Beyond Two Souls have tried it, but I want to see this concept applied to open-world games or action-adventure games. Perhaps an example would be in Grand Theft Auto 5, where the player grows to love and learn the city of Los Santos as it's currently presented. But what if they constantly shifted back and forth between related events a decade prior? You get a new look at the city and perhaps a new character, but the core gameplay still stays the same. And maybe, if we're getting ambitious, player actions in the past could influence the story in the present. Gameplay and narrative working in harmony thanks to a non-linear dual narrative. This idea has already been tried, albeit loosely, with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The player can't exactly control what happens in the past, but it still goes for a non-linear dual narrative with a large emphasis on the non-linear, considering the player can approach the game's main narrative in any order they want. Giving the player that kind of input on how the story unfolds is another way of adding to the experience of game feel, as it gives the player ownership of their order of events, another thing films can never replicate. The dual narrative is the key to further experimentation with video game storytelling. With gameplay hand in hand, it can further enrich our gameplay experiences. In order to further validate the gaming medium as a legitimate art form, it has to go beyond experimenting with gameplay mechanics. It has to evolve past a linear progressive storyline. And that's scary for a lot of developers and especially publishers. Why take a risk on something that could potentially go horribly wrong, soak up millions of dollars, and waste at least 2 years of everyone's time? The danger of being the biggest entertainment medium in the world is that publishers don't want to spend $50 million on a chance. They need a sure shot. This is where independent developers and tried and true AAA studios come in. Developers either need the freedom to experiment or the trust to innovate. Perhaps the industry doesn't need to experiment with different storytelling techniques quite yet. Maybe it doesn't need to legitimize itself. Hollywood stars like Norman Reedus or Mads Mikkelsen have already been sold on starring in video games. So perhaps it's not about legitimizing, it's about normalizing. To make video games just as part of the normal conversation as the Avengers or Star Wars. And sure, Fortnite and Call of Duty have been a part of the normal conversation for a while now, but could you imagine striking up a conversation on the street with a total stranger and they know what Metal Gear Solid is? Would they know what The Godfather is? Of course, it's one thing to hear about a game, but it's another thing to play one. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that or learned something new, please feel free to check out some of my other videos. I've built up a pretty extensive library of interesting stuff, so if you're new to the channel and like what you saw, there's plenty more where that came from. Subscribe to the channel, follow me on Twitter, or support me on Patreon. Any and all support is immensely appreciated. Relevant links will be in the description for your browsing pleasure, and as always, I'll see you next time. 一丁景気のやれや